colleague John Ireland. Let me just say a few words about our Forum on 15 lecture series in general. As you all know, this is a lecture series organized by our School of Literature, Spiritual Studies and Linguistics. And John kindly agreed to be our last speaker. In 2014, we already had 5 very successful talks, and we are thrilled that you agreed to speak to us today on Veterans Day on this topic of the Vichy years and the Algerian War and French theater. This is going to be lovely. Let me give you a brief preview of, well, I mean, it's a good way to commemorate our veterans. And let me give you a brief preview of the talks we have lined up for the coming spring semester. So we will switch slightly, we will pivot from the theme of memory to the theme of temporalities, and we will have Jennifer Presto visiting us, a Russianist, early in the spring semester, who will talk to us about Russians in Sicily. You know, that's probably where I would go if I were a Russianist. Choice there. And then our own Tatiana Gajic will also speak, and also Pavas Papamikos from the Department of Classics and Mediterranean Studies. So watch for the information that will be forthcoming about these talks. But now let me introduce John properly. So John Ireland received his PhD from New York University, and he joined UIC's faculty in 1993 and has been a fixture in the French department ever since. He is a very prolific scholar. I would probably be spending the next half hour here if I were to go through his CV in detail. So let me just mention that he has published numerous articles and volumes on French theatre and Sartre in particular, and he has published with French publishers such as Gallimard in the Bibliothèque de la Pléiade, and with Éditions Jean-Michel Place, and this is truly impressive. He has also edited special issues of journals, and he publishes on both sides of the Atlantic. So if you ask the people who have anything to do with Sartre, they would probably be familiar with our colleague John Ireland. Not least because I believe right now you are also the president of the North American Sartre Society. Is that right? Okay. So John has also held many different scholarships, among them a UIC Institute for the Humanities Fellowship. He's also a Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques, so quite impressive. And he has also won numerous recognitions for his teaching. He has won a CITL award and has had several other honors for his teaching. And on top of that, if you think he really publishes and teaches here at UIC, he also is somebody who has been, over the course of his career here at UIC, very involved in administration. Right now he is interim head of the Department of French and Francophone Studies, but he has served in this capacity in the past. He also has served on a host of committees. He has served as the director of study abroad, all kinds of things. So he has been involved in scholarship, teaching and service at UIC and in the profession at large on a very broad, in a very broad way. And I am delighted that he is going to speak to us today on a difficult but important topic, namely the topic of theatre, war memory and contemporary France. And the title of your talk is Staging the Vichy Years, 1940 to 44, and the Algerian Conflict, 1955-60. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emika, for that very generous introduction. Thank you all for coming on this day, which is in its own way a homage to the weather in Northern Europe at this time. And it's true that speaking on Veterans Day resonated with me a bit. In keeping with our theme of memory, Veterans Day, where I come from, is called Remembrance Day. And this 100th anniversary of 1914, people saw the pictures of all the poplars around the tower. I was actually telling my French 201 students last week, readings attached to it, that on November 11th I always think back to my English childhood. I came up from a pretty secular family, and the first really meaningful collective ritual that I encountered was the 2-minute silence on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month every year. It was just so powerful. Everyone was invested. My parents' generation was indelibly marked by World War II. My grandparents' generation around the world. And the veterans were all there, in front of us, in uniform. And every kid could see that they were filled with intense emotion. In those days, the World War I veterans had a little bit more prestige. Their uniforms were really old. They were already old men, and every family knew that that part of living memory would disappear very soon, as it has, of course. And then there were the names, mythical places of enormous sacrifice and bloodshed: Verdun, Passchendaele, Vimy Ridge, almost secular stations of the cross. Ypres, so that's Y-P-R-E-S, which the British Army could never pronounce, and they just called it wipers. My grandfather was a great storyteller. When I visited, I would get into bed with him on Sunday mornings, and sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, he would tell me about World War I. Stories were heavily edited. I heard much more about his cool motorbike, dispatch rider, than dying soldiers. But sometimes I wonder if my research interest in war trauma and culture isn't linked in some way to those memories. In any case, World War I features quite a bit in my talk today. I began this book project with a very basic objective. A number of dramatists whose work interested me deeply had written what I thought were compelling plays about the two most difficult periods of 20th century French history: the German occupation of 1940 to 44 and the Algerian War of 1954 to 62. In response to the crises and traumas precipitated by these two conflicts, these dramatists had crafted very different responses that redefined in some cases what we think of as theatre. Some of these dramatists, Sartre in particular, were well known. Others like Khatab Yassine, Marine Gatti, and Jean-Claude Grandin had attracted some critical commentary, but were still known primarily only by specialists, while other innovative playwrights, such as William Atlan or Noureddin Abba, had barely been studied at all. Initially, I felt that a book linking the creative preoccupations of these major artists and making the latter playwrights better known to a wider Anglophone audience was all the justification that my project would need. Confident that I knew the plays well and had a reasonable grasp of the critical material devoted to them, I spent many months on historical research, reading intensively about the two conflicts and the repercussions they engendered that continue to reverberate today. As I engaged with the enormous bibliography attached to both historical periods, a number of questions emerged that revitalized my thinking in ways I had not anticipated at all. In 1987, a young French historian, Henri Rousseau, wrote a groundbreaking book translated in 1991 as The Vichy Syndrome: History and Memory in France since 1944, that began to delineate the scope of the problematic memory of the Vichy years, still unresolved in 1987, just as it remains only fractionally less unresolved 25 years later. In 1991, another young historian, Benjamin Stora, who has since become the most influential authority on the Algerian War, wrote a book about the legacy of that conflict, whose title, La Gangrène et l'Oubli, Gangrene and Forgetting, emphasized even more starkly the years of neglect and repression that followed Algeria's independence in 1962, and the cost of that silence in France 30 years later. 20 years further along, we are still coming to terms with that cost. These two conflicts, more than any other in France, are linked to problems of personal memory and official remembrance that are connected in turn to what Pierre Nora has termed a crisis in historiography. Both have contributed heavily to the disruption of a discipline entrusted with the responsibility for making sense of the past. One of the results of this crisis is an arresting paradox. After the years of silence, these two conflicts have attracted so much attention that the critical bibliographies attached to them is enormous. And yet, despite their size and range, these massive archives still leave a dominant impression of incompleteness, as if each piece of commentary and archival testimony could only extend an interminable puzzle, instead of putting in place even a basic consensus. In neither case have we seen the emergence of a dominant narrative, which, as Nora has demonstrated, has helped historiography in the past achieve at least a semblance of closure. In a number of ways, the plays in my study indicate that they are very conscious of contributing both to a historiographical and to an epistemological debate. Another result of this crisis of history and memory was a very mixed archive of heterogeneous data, featuring both documented research and lived experience. Yet another was a massive imaginative effort, as the two conflicts inspired innumerable novels, plays, films, paintings, and drawings, among other manifestations of artistic expression. Both Rousseau and Storace invoke artistic creation as an important conductor of experience and memory. Significantly, however, the two historians mention only novels, memoirs, and films, the dominant purveyors of popular culture today. Neither mentions a single play. Here then, I felt, was another very pragmatic reason for a book on the theatre inspired by these conflicts. It is true that in terms of numbers, very few plays nowadays can reach the mass audiences attained by best-selling fiction or popular cinema, let alone contemporary social media. But theatre's importance, it seems to me, is no longer to be calculated in numerical terms. Plays, because of the particular conditions attached to them, communicate in different ways than novels or films. And when it comes to problems of violence and war trauma, plays are one of our oldest surviving cultural institutions for representing and discussing them. In comparison, both the novel and even more particularly film are recent cultural bump. From that perspective, an early point worth underlining is that even as the 20th century precipitated a cultural and educational sea change by progressively eliminating Greek, Latin, and classical culture from the core of its educational curriculum, Greek tragedies remain a mainstay of the Western theatrical repertoire, and indeed, despite a very different conception of the theatrical act, influenced both directly and less conspicuously several playwrights of this study. So that while, from one point of view, it's quite logical that more critical attention should have been paid to novels and films dealing with both the Second World War and the Algerian conflict, it is also important to ask the question, can contemporary playwrights take on the problem of war and violence in ways that are inaccessible to novelists or filmmakers, even as they reconnect in unexpected ways with the classical heritage judged less and less relevant to world events today? Today, in this forum, I want to take an as yet uncharted path through this material. Over the years, I've given at our in-between conferences and other venues a number of presentations on dramatists and the historical periods associated with this project. Today I want to explore what I think are the deeper roots of this project, engaging a wider framework of inquiry and theoretical interest that I hope gives these contemporary plays and performance pieces additional resonance. I want to link the problem of memory, contemporary historiography, and recent theatrical research in France to theoretical developments in cultural anthropology on the one hand, and on the other, the two are very much related, to theatre's enduring connection with morality and oral culture, an object of study that has sustained if muted attention throughout the 20th century, even as it recedes further from our increasingly technological literacy culture, and indeed more and more escapes our comprehension. And yet, in so many different ways, we are haunted by vestiges of oral culture that seep back into our preoccupations and practices, particularly in relation to the intractable problem of human violence. My starting point is not very original insofar as it simply connects two accepted anthropological hypotheses. The first linking the origins of what we call theatre to ceremonial rituals that since time immemorial have structured religious belief across the globe. The second locates ceremonial sacrifice as the cornerstone of religious ritual, conceived both to channel and contain human violence and consecrate social values and ideals. Justifying that connection is perhaps less important than underlining its influence in France, since much of the research and theory in that area was articulated by French anthropologists. Following the pioneering work by Émile Durkheim and his nephew Marcel Mauss at the end of the 19th century on the origins of sacrifice and totemism, that posited the sacred not as the creation of an already existing social body, but as an integral feature of the process by which society and social order are constituted, this line of thought was further developed and widely disseminated in the 20th century by the Collège de Sociologie ethnographers Michel Léris, Georges Bataille, and Roger Caillois during the interwar years, before being taken up again by Monier Girard in a series of very influential books in the 1970s and 80s. Much of the impetus for these developments in the 20th century came from the traumatizing carnage of the First World War, whose influence on so many fields of research associated with the emerging disciplines of the social sciences cannot be overestimated. In the wake of the First World War, Freud theorized on man's destructive penchant for war, and in the interwar years developed a series of reflections linking violence, religion, and war in a seminal contribution to anthropological thinking that consistently linked modern civilizations to non-literacy cultures. So I was working on this, but I thought back to Heidi's paper at the in-between conference and the great debate that followed that paper. This is my late contribution. From totem and taboo to Moses and monotheism, Freud's reflections on religion, nationhood, and mass psychology link the formation of social ideals and justice to originary crimes and obsessive and compulsive neurosis, in which subjects ritually perform actions designed to ward off the intolerable burden of a guilt-ridden mind. Mass formation, and particularly religious mass formation, is from that perspective a regulating mechanism for human communities, instituting normative behavior that accepts prescribed and proscribed acts while inducing its members to repeat, in the daily actions required of them, the actions of a subject who knows he is a great deal to atone for. For me, Freud's analysis here builds on a central insight of Durkheim. Durkheim posits that social reality is at its core a moral reality. Societies are held together by feelings of right and wrong. And Durkheim proposes a mechanism by which moral sentiments are produced and shaped into specific social forms. That mechanism is ritual. In my thinking, this insight was crucial. Not only did it link the social and the religious developed here by Freud and others, but it also anticipates so much later analysis of everyday secular life, in particular Erwin Goffman's work on interaction rituals, or even so much of Sartre's ontology. But going back to Freud, what I want to highlight is less his denunciation of religion as delusional, fueled by the false consolations of belief, than his conclusion that the ideals and ethics we derive from ritually enacted normative precepts are fundamentally narcissistic. As we struggle to remain our own preferred object, suggests Freud, God is our spectator, even more than our savior. Extending Freud's insights, which link tribal totemism, conflict, and contemporary religious practice, Jacqueline Rose, in the wake of the US invasion of Iraq, links that narcissism to one of war's central paradoxes. Warfare, she maintains, is a deadly repository of a most cherished, tenacious, and precarious self-idealization. Because it is so ugly, it must be good, civilized in its conduct, and civilized in its aims. In psychoanalytic terms, she suggests, quote, you might say that narcissists are so frantic and despairing because of the extent of the damage they are struggling to repair. In the same way, it is because war is so terrible that we invest so heavily in the belief that it can be the bearer of civilization to other peoples. Rose then returns to Freud's reflections in assessing the damage done to the belief in the virtue of democracy's representative institutions. People are more or less represented by the states which they form, and these states by the governments which rule them. But in time of war, the citizen is faced with the horror that the state has forbidden to the individual the practice of wrongdoing, not because it desires to abolish it, but because it desires to monopolize it, like salt and tobacco. A belligerent state not only violates its civic laws in relation to its enemies, but also the principles that bind it to its own citizens. A belligerent state permits itself every such misdeed, every act of violence as would disgrace the individual. No surprise then, amongst Rose, that faced with the misdeeds of Abu Ghraib, for example, the state will rush to return them to the citizen of manifestations of individual disgrace. Concomitantly, in time of war, the state connives, using secrecy and censorship among other tools, to rob its citizens of their capacity for critical response. And worse still, it insists that its worst belligerence is a virtue. In time of war, the state demands of its citizens the suspension of their right not to believe in it. The citizen is barred from acknowledging his own disillusionment. And this, Rose concludes, is the lie at the core of democracy. The state sacrifices its citizens' freedom to take dissent to the limit, and indeed sacrifices its own relationship to them for the sake of its own violently enacted and violently preserved self-regard. Jacqueline Rose was applying for its insights to the United States after the shock and awe campaign in Iraq, and I cannot think of a better diagnostic summary of the trauma that followed France's dirty war in Algeria. And I note in passing that on the eve of the Iraq invasion of 2003, Donald Rumsfeld showed Pontecorvo's landmark film on the Battle of Algiers to the US Department of Defense as a projected model for the US occupation of Baghdad. I have deliberately taken parameters extending from the First World War to the early 21st century to suggest that throughout the 20th century we can trace a tenuous but stubborn link connecting early reflections on sacrifice, religious ritual, and social formation to problem of violence and conflict, an inquiry for which the First World War was an important catalyst that French anthropology in particular pursued in an attempt to better account for the endemic and insoluble problem of human violence. In the interwar years, the Collège de Sociologie ethnographers took the matrix of these elements and developed it in a number of ways. One of the most fascinating is supplied by that most idiosyncratic of French theorists, Georges Bataille, who transposes an archaic anthropological model onto contemporary Paris with one brief historical tour and an updated secular avatar that is in thinking. Ostensibly, he is reflecting on slaughterhouses, urban renewal, culture, and collective memory. His starting point is the article Abattoir, Slaughterhouse, that he contributed in 1929 to the dictionary section of the magazine Document he was editing, in which he re-established the connection between animal slaughter and sacrifice. And what I'm putting up behind me in the first couple of rows are the photographs of the La Villette Abattoir by Elie Lothar, a photographer, that were placed in juxtaposition to Bataille's entry. I'm not going to comment particularly on them, but I want to give you just a second to try and decide what it is that you are seeing. These images are obviously striking, very disturbing, some of them, and we will perhaps talk about them more at the end. But building on Mauss's theory of sacrifice, Bataille asserts that slaughterhouses that modern society has tried to secularize have only managed to revive in the minds of modern citizens the fear and horror that sacrifice was conceived to dispel. As a result, he concludes, we are left with the remnants of a discredited ceremony that nobody ever attends. I quote, the slaughterhouse relates to religion in the sense that temples of times past had two purposes, serving simultaneously for prayer and for slaughter. Nowadays, the slaughterhouse is cursed and quarantined like a boat with cholera aboard. The victims of the curse are neither the butchers nor the animals, but those fine folk who have reached the point of not being able to stand their own unseemliness, corresponding, in fact, to a pathological need for cleanliness. It's interesting that in his novel he arrives at this narcissistic track that Freud was also engaged in making clear. The counterpart to Bataille's abattoir article is to be found in another entry he wrote for the Document Dictionary, entitled simply Museum. I quote, "On Sundays at 5 o'clock, at the exit to the Louvre, it is interesting to admire the stream of visitors visibly animated by the desire to be similar in every way to the heavenly visions still delighting their eyes." For Bataille, notes Denis Ollier perceptively, a museum is like the lungs of a great city. A crowd pours into the museum every Sunday like blood, and it leaves purified and refreshed. The sacrificial model invoked by Bataille re-establishes the poles of sublimated religion, culture, and ritual sacrifice, which connect the Louvre to Paris's most famous square on its western edge. And here, Bataille makes his brief detour into history. The Louvre was, after all, turned into a museum by the revolutionary Convention, when royalty was sacrificed, very literally, on the adjoining square to the public good. The museum, suggests Bataille, is what revolutionary terror invented to replace the king. So again, the origin of the modern museum includes Bataille, but must be linked to the development of the guillotine. Bataille re-establishes the link and the tension between the sacred and the cultural that fill those periods of capitalist modernity where man is not productively working, suggests Ollier in an article brilliantly entitled Bloody Sundays. Like Freud, Bataille suggests that at the heart of religion, but also of beauty, lies a murder, a sacrifice, a killing we have willfully repressed. Bataille reminds us quite bluntly of the link between blood and culture, between event and forgetting, as he retraces the different uses of architecture and urban space in history. The most famous city square in France, Paris's Place de la Concorde, is a site of organized political amnesia. In reflecting on its name, Bataille returns us to the site of a revolutionary beheading that was effaced, transformed, and ultimately renamed by the citizen king, Louis Philippe. Concord, the antonym of discord, heralds a new beginning and a peace offering, a baptism in olive branch designed to dispel any remaining discord of class or politics that historical memory might revive, and the corresponding transformation of space that produces a square of gardens, fairgrounds, and museums, monuments to forgetting the blood that founded modern France. Initially, this extraordinary demonstration seemed marginal to my investigation of later French history. But Bataille's demonstration, it seems to me, is haunted by a conflict he never names, reproduced by the abattoir photographs that represent, in transposed form, the degraded carnage of World War I. And willful amnesia and elision were central, if unacknowledged, features of de Gaulle's cultural program in the 8 years that separated the loss of French Algeria and his own death in 1970. In that period, not one, but 43 military museums were inaugurated in France. De Gaulle's museums, it is true, do not entirely conform to Bataille's ironically redemptive model, although irony is not lacking. Making no reference whatsoever to a war in Algeria that the French state still refused to recognize. These new cultural institutions were conceived 20 years on to commemorate events from 2 world wars, highlighting in particular the exploits of the French resistors. The desire to efface contested experience and contested honor, which is already an understated summary of French conduct in Algeria, by subsuming it within a longer period of accredited history, was a tactic de Gaulle had already exploited by inserting the equally problematic Vichy years into what he often referred to as the 30-year war, 1914 to 1944, a wider framework from which more substantial commemorative capital could still be gleaned. At the same time as historical and anthropological currents link violence and sacrificial ritual in a number of ways, classical Greek tragedy, a repository of both anthropological and historical memory, and also linked to ritual, is reevaluated by a number of disciplines for its different contributions to reflections on violence. A landmark contribution was made by ethnographer René Girard, introducing the notion of surrogate victimage. If you remember all those theories of the scapegoat and Viridian Pharmacos some years back. So this contribution to Durkheim's theory of ritual sacrifice. But Girard linked it specifically to detailed analysis of Greek tragedy, to to show how ritual theatre both explores the mechanisms of mimetic or revenge violence and then synchronizes its insights. But together with this theatre-ritual violence connection, I was also very conscious of the seminal role of oral culture and looked for ways in which oral culture survived in the 20th century, even as an increasingly hegemonic textual culture took hold. Paradoxically, perhaps, the 20th century has proved unexpectedly sensitive to features of oral culture. There are, I think, two reasons for this, both with roots in the First World War. First of all, slowly but surely, anthropology dismantled accepted notions of cultural hierarchy and supremacy that had become second nature to 19th century European cultures with pronounced colonial ambitions. Secondly, attacks on European cultural norms began to multiply in the wake of the First World War, laying bare the pretensions of Eurocentric idealism and seriously undermining its cultural prestige. Artistic movements such as Dadaism and Surrealism introduced elements of African performance culture into the European artistic consciousness, with durable consequences. Critics like Michel Bourgeois have stressed the tension, for example, between the early Surrealist celebration of the séance, which is a collective ritual performance art, as a crucible for creation, and then later the gradual textual recuperation of what began as a revolt against elitism and hierarchy, as Breton, Éluard, and others culled and selected parts of their poetic utterances in these séances for publication and conservation in book form. In that sense, says Bourgeois, Artaud's break with Breton and the Surrealists to engage in non-textual theatrical research, seeking conditions of performance that would connect performers and audiences with external forces, can be seen both as a pure vein of Surrealist inquiry and an attempt to rediscover and harness the virtues and forces of ritual oral culture as a basis of theatrical creation. And I think, too, in passing, that Artaud's absolutely mythical status in French theatre, that his actual theatrical production could never match, is that he embodied the aspiration to make that connection in all its imagined and fantasized power. In the final section of my talk, I want to connect recent French research on morality to some of the dramatists in my study. For many more centuries than those for which literacy has been the norm, collective groups defined by a common language and culture came together in ritualized settings to celebrate in metered spoken language, generally with music and some form of dance or rhythmic movement as an integral component of the event. Parts of a vast story whose tales were simultaneously a repository of their identity and mythic history, their values and beliefs. For centuries, to choose one of the most famous examples, around the Mediterranean basin, groups attached to Greek and neighboring cultures sang tales about a mythic war between their ancestors and the enemy Trojans, until Pan-Hellenic festivals, in an attempt to bridge competing dialects, used a written alphabet that epic culture had previously scorned to stitch together a number of potential performances into a fixed form gradually known as the Iliad. For unabashed champions of oral culture, like France's Florence Dupont, the transformation of a performance right into written form was an act of cultural mutilation that gradually destroyed the meaning attached to a ritual popular event and replaced it with stored, frozen models, scrolls and papyri that were eventually entombed in libraries, most famously the Library of Alexandria, to be perused by professionals trained in the new literacy technology. In the 6th century BC, the Athenians adapted another oral ritual honoring Dionysos that also fell victim to the new textual culture. As they in turn exploited the mythical tales of the long war with Troy and later the Persian wars that became the subject matter of so many Athenian tragedies, these too were recorded in written form to be stored, studied, and imitated. But along with what were rapidly becoming written as, theatre maintained its connection with live oral culture by being tied to the theatron, or scene place, where custom dictated tragedies be enacted as ritual spectacle, until Aristotle undermined even that fundamental connection. Florence Dupont, a very influential French classicist, reminds us that Aristotle was neither a man of the theatre nor an Athenian, which distanced him doubly from the culture of the theatron. The poetics, she suggests, were in all likelihood lecture notes for his students at the Lyceum. His project, philosophical and normative, is to define the tragic poem, the notion that we now think of as Aristotelian, as are the categories of mythos and drama, separating its essence from any performative context and classifying the dramatic works from the past worthy to rank as model. In his insistence on mimesis, the poetic art of representation through language, Aristotle distances tragedy from any religious or social ritual. The essence of tragedy, Aristotle says, is contained in the self-sufficient text that need not be tied to any stage performance. Spectacle, opsis, while highly effective, is yet quite foreign to the art. Indeed, the effect of tragedy does not depend on its performance by actors. The irony is not lost on Dupont. From Aristotle's poetics perspective, theatre, a term derived from the most pragmatic of sensory functions, seeing, has no need of spectacle. In place of a theatrical event, judged and evaluated in the ritual context of an Athenian festival, Aristotle seeks to establish a theatrical text whose adherence to prescribed poetic principles will allow its value to be determined outside of any performative context by any competent reader. He is the first person to subordinate the performance of the text and an audience to a solitary reader. In that sense, concludes Dupont, Aristotle's contribution to modern textual culture cannot be overstated. His seminal Poetics, arguably the most influential work of literary aesthetics that Western culture has ever produced, set out rules for a world of books and a new conception of culture that still envelops us today. From Dupont's unabashed oralist perspective, Aristotle's Poetics spawned a two-headed monster of limitless hermeneutics and archives, as well as a new and elitist educational system. And in measuring the cost of that transition, Dupont reminds us that although the writing-reading dad became a constant of Greek culture from the 5th century on, it never acceded to a culture of autonomous status. In sharp contrast to the expectations of modern readers, solitary reading was not considered an experience to be savoured. Books never gave the ancients, she says, what intoxication and festivity brought. For Dupont, ancient writing was a statement perpetually in quest of a speech act, a social setting where human breath and warmth would animate the written words and give them life. Writing pointed at human absence, and it is this central issue, already identified and denounced as far back as Socrates, that 20th century dramatists seize on in a variety of ways to create an enclave in the literary culture around them, in which they can institute a very different kind of creation and communication. Let's begin with Sartre, and emphasize that he, like most of the other dramatists that interest me, is a happy member of our dominant textual culture. Words for Sartre, famously commemorated by the title of his autobiography, Les mots, words, are primarily written words, the ones he encountered as a child in the temple of his grandfather's library that launched his initiation into literacy. One of the book's most famous sentences, selected for the back cover of the folio edition, reads very simply, quote, "I began my life as I shall no doubt end it, amidst books." And yet Sartre, particularly later in life, was also conscious and critical of the isolating tendencies of textual culture. A novelist works alone and is separated from his readers both spatially and, with the passage of time, temporally as well. Readers generally read in isolation too, completing the fragmenting effect of textual dissemination. It is no coincidence that Sartre's critique of the novel, the dominant literary genre since the early 19th century, as an isolating medium, should also be more generally applicable to the cult of the exceptional individual celebrated by bourgeois culture and ideology, characterized by Sartre as a civilization of solitudes. In contrast, Sartre associated theatrical production with oral culture's primary virtue, presentness, implying both the present and presence, qualities which mean in turn that context, the pragmatic meaning of an event taking place in a specific place at a specific moment in time, trumps any other interpretive process. Oral culture is also collective. The performances and audiences are equally indispensable for the meaning of the event to be created, which implies by the same token that the issue of mediation, a constant problem of textual culture, is reduced to the lowest possible fact. Significantly, it was the immediacy of this kind of transmission and reception that Sartre began to promote after 1945 as the ideal horizon to galvanize the new literary economy of liberated France. This post-war conception of littérature engagée, the artistic consequence of his political conversion brought about by the Second World War, seeks above all to engage the present, to be current, to be timely, to connect the writer and his subject matter to the problems faced by his contemporary readers. As such, it will break with the more established and accepted view of literature, and particularly of great literature, held by the humanist tradition, but also by contemporaries of Sartre like Blanchot, as something that has stood the test of time. In other words, that can transcend particular historical periods and problems to become timeless, which is a much more Aristotelian take on literary culture. It was thus logical for Sartre to turn increasingly to theatre as the preferred genre of committed literature from the late 1940s on, because theatrical production not only emphasizes but institutes the present, the here and the now. The play is staged in a place and at a time where its context, its spatial and temporal situation can give its content special resonance. In those conditions, its words can and should become speech acts, having real direct impact on its audience, whose immediate response completes the meaning of the event. This is what Sartre hoped to achieve with his first two plays, Bariona and The Flies, both adaptations of ritual drama. Bariona is a nativity play, and The Flies is adapted from the Aristide, whose fullest sense would be inseparable from the context of captivity and occupation in which they were created. There is nothing, of course, in principle to stop novels or films or videos, to mention our most obvious contemporary cultural conduits, from achieving that same resonance. I want to stress, however, that theatre has one huge defining advantage over both narrative literature and film. The latter are both ultimately archival forms of culture, which, of course, theatre, dependent on live performance, never is. A specific example may help make that comparison clear. In 1937, Jean Renoir made one of his greatest films, Grand Illusion. Released at the height of Léon Blum's popular front, this pacifist film, which follows the fortunes of a number of French POWs from the First World War through a series of prison camps in Germany, was admired by critics and audiences alike. Its denunciation, not only of war, but of the lies and propaganda that accompany strident nationalism, was widely appreciated, as was the film's appeal for international tolerance and cooperation. One remembers the moving scenes at the end of the film when the two starving escaped prisoners, one of them a Jew, are nursed back to health by Elsa, a young German war widow, who tells them in one scene that the photos they are examining on the mantelpiece of her living room are pictures of her husband and two brothers whose lives were lost at Verdun, Charleroi, and Tannenberg. Our greatest victories, she adds with bitter irony. With great delicacy, Renoir traces the developing and largely wordless romance between Elsa and Lieutenant Maréchal, played by Jean Gabin, who promises through the intermediary of his Jewish-speaking Jewish comrade, Rosenthal, to come back and fetch Elsa and her infant daughter Lotte as soon as the war is over. 8 years, however, in 1945, when Renoir re-released his pre-war film, which was, of course, suppressed in France by German censors during the occupation years, the virtues of Renoir's popular front pacifism were seen in a very different light, particularly by former members of the French resistance. The idea that a French soldier might owe a German woman anything, let alone fall in love with a Boche in wartime, was intolerable for a newly liberated France that had just finished shaving the heads of French women who had demonstrated a corresponding weakness. Significantly, the actress Dieter Parler, who played the German widow, felt the need to publicly regret having accepted the role. Equally intolerable was the scene where the aristocratic Captain Weldieu, watching German recruits training, is moved to comment, quote, "The sound of army boots on the parade ground is the same the world over. In newly liberated France, the sound of good French army boots was not to be confused with morally indefensible Nazi boots." Faced with this public outcry, Renoir had no other recourse than to cut out the offending scenes. In the immediate post-war years, French audiences could only view mutilated copies of this great film. Consider in contrast Sartre's 1943 play The Flies, written during the occupation, which adapted the classical Greek Oresteia myth to bypass German censorship and propose a veiled message contesting the ideology of remorse and repentance imposed by the Vichy regime, and issuing in its place a call to violent resistance and liberation. 5 years later, Sartre learned that The Flies was being staged in Berlin, where, infused with issues relating to post-war Germany, it became a very different play with a very different message. Invited to Berlin to talk about the play, Sartre begins his remarks by saying, quote, "The whole debate revolves around this point. What did The Flies mean when the play was staged in Paris in 1943 during the occupation? And what is the meaning of its current staging in Berlin? In these very different circumstances, Sartre shows that he's prepared to see the particular poetics that had given the play its raison d'être in Paris in 1943, supplanted by a German production rooted in a very different situation that has effectively transformed The Flies into a very different speech act. He chooses, in other words, to highlight the defining virtue of theatre. With each staging of a play, theatrical production stresses the context of its staging as an essential signifying component of both the creative and the hermeneutic process. The question of the context of historical moment that can potentially kill or mutilate an archival form of culture like film is precisely what keeps theatre alive. 5 more minutes? Can you take 5 more minutes? Sartre's first and last theatrical productions are adaptations of Greek tragedy. The Flies is a call to arms, and its genesis during the German occupation initiated an investment by Sartre in violence as a tool of liberation in ways that would not always serve him well after 1945. Interestingly, throughout the 1950s and 60s, while Sartre consistently supported the right of colonialism's victims to armed and violent insurrection and even political assassination, his last play, a 1965 adaptation of Euripides' Trojan Women, ends with one of Sartre's most striking innovations, quite absent from the original play. In a final monologue, the Greek god Poseidon turns to the audience. "Wage war, foolish mortals," he says. "It will kill you, all of you." Significantly, unlike the political militant or the public intellectual, the dramatist had by the mid-1960s a much less optimistic assessment of violence as a tool for change. Even so, Sartre's adaptation of Euripides was conceived as a political, anti-imperialist production of the play, which meant, notes Nicole Laurent, that it emphasized confrontation over lamentation, dialogue over sustained statement. In the original Euripides text, there is a constitutive role given to music, rhythmic chanting, and dance, which function as a counterpart to its textual elements, and above all to its moments of dialogue. The dimension of ritual mourning, woven into the entire fabric of the Trojan War, is an essential component of Greek tragedy. What Nicole Laurent calls the mourning voice is a continual reminder that the theatre of Dionysos is not in the agony. The tragedy is not susceptible to civic resolution. The dialogue, the essential component of civic harmony, and the basis of decision-making in the polis, is thwarted in tragedy. Above all, ritual mourning is the reminder that voice is itself split between sound and meaning, and that the question of musicality and sound is reproduced in the different cries inherent in speech, by which physical and mental anguish and strong emotion assert their place together with lyric, reasoning, and measured exchange. Contemporary dramatists of war drama, dealing with grief and remembrance, have also sought to introduce commemorative mourning into recent performative contexts in a variety of ways. One of the most imaginative was Lynette Atlan's decision to approach the extermination of the musicians and artists of the Theresienstadt concentration camp through a form of performance stripped of its theatrical elements. An opera for Therésine is conceived not as a play, but as a ritual whose model is the Jewish Passover Seder. There are no actors, there are no spectators. Like the Haggadah, the text of Atlan's opera is read by participants at a series of tables, ritually set in any community space, and ideally, and this is where her breathtaking ambition comes in, simultaneously performed in different countries, in different languages, all linked together electronically, in an effort to achieve what she calls une rencontre de l'étoile, the star. And it's almost as if she's trying to transmute the yellow star into a meeting, a symbolic meaning, overcoming that sign of stigma with a kind of international and even sort of cosmic meeting and communion. Atlan was fascinated by the potential of a new creative act to achieve a different kind of transmutation of culture. In this way, a major event in recent European history, the extermination and the resistance of its greatest artists during the Second World War, will be relived through the power of ritual throughout a whole night, as if it were present in our flesh. Ultimately, what is fascinating about an opera for Thérèse is its indeterminate generic status. The ambition to graft a meticulously researched section of the Shoah, a project of extermination, onto the ritual affirming the foundational myth of the Jewish people is as daring as it is blasphemous. In the final movement of our opera, 10 plagues are introduced that target not the oppressor, but the chosen people itself. Atlan makes clear that her opera will remember and honor every conceivable reaction of Shoah survivors, even those for whom the Seder ritual has become unbearable. This creative tension established between the profane performance and the Jewish ritual, an ambivalence crystallizing the repeated phrase, the rite of the opera, also reflects Atlan's personal situation. Deeply invested in Judaism's mystical tradition, Atlan stopped practicing Jewish ritual herself. I think that at the heart of her venture is an aesthetic re-evaluation of the notion of communion and a strategy to recast the vertical divine form of communion into a lateral communion of linked human communities. I don't really have a conclusion. I thought I would mention that I just finished an article on the great Algerian playwright Khatib Yassine, who wrote a kind of Trojan horse style in the 1950s, an extraordinary four-cycle play to protest French colonial oppression and violence. But then in the early 1970s, he returned from Europe to launch a very different kind of theatrical initiative, working with a collective group called the Théâtre de la Mer, who toured Algeria for almost 7 years, working on a number of themes: immigration, history, and the position of women in Algerian society. The theatrical collective blended Western techniques with indigenous forms of storytelling, using the dialect of whatever part of the country the group found itself in. The audience, often literate, was encouraged to contribute to each performance. I've heard that over 7 years, these performances reached nearly 1 million Algerians. In 2004, the Édition des Femmes in Paris published French translations of the play dealing with women and the revolution. These are the only documents I have or know of that adventure. For the first time, I really felt all the disappointment that Florence Dupont expresses so eloquently. These translated traces were so impoverished, abandoned, in desperate need of circumstances and the voices that gave them life. This is the obvious but terrible quandary of oral culture that the ancients already identified with their core benedictum. Verba volant, scripta manent. Speech is fleeting.